So we're going to talk about the Mount Airy Eastern Railroad, which was also the Virginia and North Carolina Railroad and all kinds of other names because it kept going bankrupt and they would change the name of it. It ran from about 1899 to we think about 1924, give or take. And I'm not really going to talk about the railroad part of it. I'm not going to talk about Baldwin 260s or 280s, whatever that is. We're going to talk about the people who lived along this railroad and some of the things that happened to them, some of the things they got into as this railroad progressed. But here's one of my favorite pictures of two fellas on the Dinky. So that's what we're about tonight. We're just going to talk about some of the people, and I'm going to tell some stories. Some of them are true, maybe some of them are not. So advance it one more time there, Master Snyder. So the railroad came to Mount Airy about 1888 or so, give or take. It's the train station is still on South Street in Mount Airy. They don't really use it for anything, but it's there. And right across the street from that is where Andy Griffith, believe it or not, was born. So there's your two big things that happened in Mount Airy right across the street from each other. But this, of course, I guess will become, what was it, the Cape Fear in Wilmington, something like that. It'll eventually, I guess, get gobbled up by the Southern. I believe that's right. Next one, if you would there, Cole. And you can see it moving up the white line and up there near the very top. And then one more, Cole. And here's the Mount Airy Eastern, running out of Mount Airy up to Kibler Valley in Virginia. Kibler Valley is where the Dan River comes out of the mountain before it makes its meandering ride all the way to the coast. But if you look at this map, you can see Mount Airy there. You can see the Sulphur Springs, which we'll talk about. You see Pettigo. Nunn is where Andy Griffith's mother grew up. She was Geneva Nunn, N-U-N-N. My joke, of course, is you know Andy Griffith's mother was a nun. She wasn't a Catholic nun. She was a Kibler Valley nun. And then Kibler. So Pettigo we'll talk about, and Nunn we'll talk about. And you can see over here on the right, Stuart, Virginia, which is our county seat. And the Danville and Western Railroad, which was a standard gauge railroad, came into Stuart. If that railroad had been there about 1870, R.J. Reynolds would have stayed home and there wouldn't be no hyphen in Winston and Salem because he would have stayed home in Patrick County and built his tobacco empire because he came to Winston looking for a railroad. So the Danville and Western is there. They thought about connecting these two railroads up, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but they either ran out of money or could never get their ducks in a row to actually do that. Otherwise, they would have went to Mount Airy to Stuart and used a good bit, I think, of the Mount Airy Eastern to do that after standard gauging it. Next one, please. This is Kenny Kirkman. Dutch was talking about Kenny. 20 years ago, Kenny and I decided we were going to try to go out and find this railroad. It was gone, or at least we thought it was gone. And Kenny lives over in Collinsville, Virginia. Yeah. Well, you may be surprised. You may be surprised. But you ought to get Kenny to come down here and talk. He's pretty good at this sort of thing. But me and him walked over 2 or 3 winters. We went out and would walk every week. We'd walk a couple of miles and try to find this railroad. And we did. We found it. Or for the most part, we found it. But Kenny is a retired produce man at a supermarket, and he's just obsessed with railroads. Like you say, he's in the Roanoke group, but he lives up in Collinsville, near Martinsville. And like I said, he and I went out and we walked the whole 20 miles of this railroad over the course of several winters. Next one, please. Cole's grandmother works in the Mount Airy Museum of Regional History. She's the curator, and they have a little exhibit about the Dinky, and they have a little model railroad thing they've built. They're redoing it right now, as a matter of fact, in the History Museum in Mount Airy. So if you're up there, don't just go see Andy, go see the other museum. Now I can go home because it'll be safe to go home because my spy there will tell her I actually talked about her museum. Next one, please, Cole. So the Mount Airy Eastern's office was in the top of this building on Main Street in Mount Airy on the left. It's now the John Deere toy shop, but it was the office of the railroad. And if you know anything about Mount Airy makes huge tourism off Andy Griffith and Mayberry and all that sort of thing. And this is right on the corner of Franklin Street. You ever heard this one? You ever heard me tell this one? Believe it or not, right here beside this building one day, a gentleman was walking down the street and he met another gentleman. The other gentleman pulled out a gun, shot him dead right there in front of this building. Apparently, they'd both been keeping time with the same woman. And one of them was married to her. So a very famous murder happened right there on the corner.
Which one survived?
The husband took out the boyfriend. The husband took out the boyfriend. Yeah. Do we have a comment about murder or mayhem? Anyway, so the bottom picture here is going out toward the granite quarry in Mount Airy. If you know Mount Airy, you know we have the world's largest open-faced granite quarry, and the railroad came into Mount Airy mainly, I think, to haul granite out of there. But if you look on the far left of this picture, you'll see what I think is the main line, and right over there to the left of it, you'll see just a little piece of the Dinky. Just a little piece of the Mount Airy Eastern because it's a little narrower, and they pulled right up beside each other, and so they could load and unload from one to the other. But this is going out toward the granite quarry. The granite quarry is still there. They ship it on trucks now, so the railroad doesn't go to the quarry anymore. Next one, please, Cole. The railroad starts in Mount Airy along the Ararat River, right where Riverside Drive and the standard gauge railroad cross each other. This used to be where Quality Mills was. Now it's Carport Central. Mount Airy's turned into the world's greatest carport manufacturing place. We used to be the king of the toaster. Now we're the king of the carport, I think. But they started with a Y, W-Y-E, there right along the river, and it's going to follow the Ararat River for several miles there. And you can see Quality Mills up there in the top right. When I was when I was in college, I actually worked in the dye house there on third shift. Had no idea my railroad was right out the door, but there it was. And you can see one of the maps we found over here on the left. Next one, Cole. This is this is Esther Johnson. Esther runs the Surrey County Genealogical Society. She had a career, obviously younger, as an airplane pilot, but she grew up right beside where the Dinky Railroad started. And one of my things I do ad nauseum, you'll hear me say this, is go find the oldest person you know and talk to them. You might be amazed what you come up with. Well, Esther found out we were working on this railroad, and this is some of her family on one of the trains. Right there, and you see at the top there, Vernon and Cecil. And Esther sat down and interviewed, and she told me all about it. That's her as a baby over there on the far left. Esther's well into her 80s now, and she has hair that I can only describe to you as the same color as Donald Trump's. That's how I will put that. But she does. Next one, please. Mount Airy is big on walking trails. This is a new trail that they've built that comes up from where we were talking about, there where Quality Mills used to be, and it's up to the new industrial park. And my friend Chip Bondurant got out there and figured out that the railroad is right there. He found a little bit of the bed, he found some spikes, and Chip has got the city of Mount Airy to do a grant proposal where they're going to build an exhibit about this railroad along the walking trail. And we'll see a picture of Chip here in just a few minutes. But he gets out with his metal detector and hunts for these things, and he found a little piece of it, still the bed of it, still there, and he found lots of spikes. You can still find lots of things if you look for the Mount Airy Eastern. Next one, please, Cole. So here's some of the engines that ran on this railroad. It's going to follow, like I say, the Ararat River. The Ararat River starts up in the Blue Ridge and runs to Siloam, North Carolina. So it goes by two Ararats. There's an Ararat, Virginia, and an Ararat, North Carolina. So there's two of them. Of course, Ararat is the mountains of Ararat where Noah's Ark landed. And y'all thought that was in Turkey. But this railroad is always going to be close to water. It's going to follow the Ararat River up to what we call Clark's Creek, and then Clark's Creek down to Fall Creek, and then the Dan River into Kibler Valley. So it's always near water because obviously it was a steam train. And so there are places Kenny and I would walk and there's no evidence of the railroad whatsoever. And then there are places we would walk where there might be miles of the bed. You can just see it. It's just as plain as day. So those are some of the engines from the railroad. And they had a little shop there where the Y was down on Riverside Drive. Next one, Cole. Believe it or not, Mount Airy used to have a gigantic resort hotel called the White Sulphur Springs. And people would come and drink that awful smelling, rotten egg sulfur water. And here it is. It was there pretty much. There was a hotel there from, say, like the mid of the 19th century up until 1955 when it burned down. People would bring, the railroad would bring people to the hotel, and they would stay for months at a time sometimes. This railroad, this hotel burned down. It hadn't really been operated for a long, long time, so they had turned it into a giant chicken coop. I'm not making this up. And it caught fire and burned to the ground. And it talk about a chicken roast. You just, I mean, it killed them all. And some idiot wrote a book about it. Came out yesterday. So there you go. Um, this is my fourth talk in 4 days. Where are we? Mount Airy Eastern, right. So this hotel was there for many, many years, and you can see it held 165, 70 rooms. It was a gigantic hotel. People used to come to Mount Airy all the time for that. If you look like right here, you can see the granite quarry right there in the Y and Mount Airy. So the railroad ran up to the White Sulphur Springs and would carry passengers. They did excursions. We'll talk about that in a minute. But believe it or not, there's the White Sulphur Springs, which burned down before I was born. Next one, Cole. Now, this is the Sparger house on the bottom. The Spargers did a deal with the people on the hotel and got this land. This turned into a tobacco plantation, kind of like the Reynolds Homestead is in Patrick County. They made chewing tobacco and things like that. This is Jane Tesh on the top left with my friend Kenny. Jane's mother and my mother worked together for 40 years at Quality Meals. Jane now lives in Texas, but before she moved down there, she let me and Kenny come and we found rails right there in the creek bed in her front yard. Cole, you'll be happy to know that this is right out from the place that I almost drowned. Um, maybe we'll let Cole tell that story. What do you think, Lauren? That'd be good. So, but there, we found rails like this. We found spikes, all kinds of stuff. But this house is still there. It was a tobacco plantation. And if you go out the road just a little bit, they grow strawberries, and oh gosh, they're good. Oh man, me and Amy have been eating gallons of these things over the last month or so. But anyway, so we found these. We find rails all over the place. So you think it's not there? It is still there. You just got to know, exactly where to look. Next one, please, Cole. So this is Totsy Hill. Totsy, I knew before he passed away. He was a World War I veteran. He is my second mother, Bertie Hill Gwynn's father. Totsy was had lived over in the middle part of Patrick County, but moved over to Mount Airy with his wife, India, and their 11 children. Only one of them still left. Only one, Nelda lives in Virginia Beach, and she's the last of 11, still with us. Now, Cole, this is where I almost drowned when I was a little boy. I was on Totsy's place. I love telling this story. Totsy had a brother named Rob, and I can't tell you how many people I grew up with who were descended from Totsy or Rob Hill. Well, between the world wars, Totsy and Rob out on their mules riding around in the Dodson area of Patrick County, and they look up and they see a hot air balloon coming down the Blue Ridge, because the Blue Ridge Mountains are right there. Well, being the fellows that they were, they had their shotguns with them, and they opened up on the hot air balloon. Totsy said, I thought it was the Germans. And they shot so many holes in the balloon. This is a true story. They shot so many holes in the balloon that the guys had to land it. And they said they took off in Maryland and they'd been shot at the whole time they'd been coming down the Blue Ridge, but it wasn't until they get to Patrick County that they actually had to land the thing. And so Totsy grew up right here across from the Dinky. And there's a huge trestle right in front of his house. It's washed out in the middle, no wood, nothing there. It's just the dirt. And we found 4 or 5 of these trestles as Kenny and I walked, just huge. And you could see right where the bed of the railroad went, and then right in the middle, there'd be nothing because that's where the creek was. So right in front of Totsy's house there. Next one, Cole. You go up almost, you cross over into Virginia, and the first thing you're going to come to is the birthplace of Jeb Stuart, who was Robert E. Lee's cavalry commander. And right here on the right, you see one of these big trestles I'm telling you about. You can't see it too well, but that's where the creek is. And if you were standing there, you could see where the railroad went on the other side. So Kenny and I found lots of these. The Jeb Stuart birthplace is a 75-acre park that's there in Ararat. He was, like I said, Robert E. Lee's cavalry commander. He was a major general, and one of the guys that started this, we saved a place of this. We have a park there. You can come up in October and they have a reenactment, and you can, well, I'll tell one on my mother. My mother was from Georgia. Do I have to tell you anything else? We have a Civil War reenactment. My mother, who was like in the WMU in the Baptist church, a hardcore Southern Baptist woman, she comes out there the first year we ever have this reenactment, and there's guys in blue laying all over the floor, the ground there. And my mother looks at me and goes, "Gosh, don't that make your heart feel good?" Sorry, you Yankees who are in the room. I can tell which ones you are because you're not smiling. But the railroad came right by what was the Jeb Stuart birthplace, obviously about 50 years after the Stuarts lived there. So they weren't contemporaries of the railroad, but it comes right by their place. Next one, Colt. Well, this is Chip Bondurant on the left. Chip is a young fella who I've been sharing all this with. I'm mentoring him because I'm not going to live forever, and I want somebody to know about this railroad. And well, sometimes maybe it's a mistake when you start mentoring people about history. You create monsters. One's sitting right there. I refer to Chip now as Dinkenstein because he is so eat up with this railroad. So this is the little piece I was telling y'all about that we built at the birthplace. We got about 20 foot of it. And believe it or not, that is Jeb Stuart's great-grandson, John Stuart. Chip got him out there and got him driving spikes into this thing. And there he is, Jeb Stuart's great-grandson.
This piece of track in at the Stuart house after our last visit, which is why we didn't see it. It's not, the railroad is not where I thought it was.
Yeah. And we think this is pretty close to where the railroad actually ran. We think it's right on the bed. But John is actually a civil engineer in Richmond. He's a VMI man, but we won't hold that against him. But Chip got him out there building the railroad with him. Next one, if you would, Cole. This is Dave Lusk, who works at the birthplace, and that's, they got a tractor out there and did this. They put up an interpretive sign about the railroad, and you can go up there and visit it now. The birthplace is open dawn to dusk. It's only like 5 miles outside of Mount Airy, if you're in Mount Airy. This railroad, I think, pretty much was built by African-American labor. We think that a few of them died and they were built, had unmarked cemetery along the railroad. We never could find that, but that was always the local legend about it. But so we've rebuilt this railroad 2 times, and I'll show you at the end the next one. But Chip did this interpretive sign about it, and I think he did a really good job. Next one, please, Cole. And here he is holding some spikes. What he does is the railroad ran across his family's place, his grandfather Porter, and Chip will take groups of people out there, kids mainly, and will walk across his grandpa's place right on where the railroad went, and he takes his metal detector and he lets the kids hunt for spikes, and if they find one, he gives it to them, and they can have a little piece of the Mount Airy Eastern. But that's Chip with his metal detector. We've done this a couple times where we do walking tours of the railroad, and I'll let you know next time we do that. Next one, please, Cole. Here's Chip's grandpa, Porter. Porter drove trucks for Bradley and Patton's armies during World War II. He was quite a fellow, lived to be 96 years old. And again, find the oldest person you know and go talk to him. Porter actually rode this railroad, so he knew exactly where it went. And I found him and his sister. He had an older sister. Her name was Carrie Sue Bondurant Culler. She lived to be 107. And both of them rode the railroad. Now, Porter gave me this picture of him in his uniform, and his comment to me that day was, "movie star good looking." Chip looks kind of just like him now. But by the way, he loved Bradley and hated Patton. So there's your World War II history for the day. But so you see Kenny and Porter and Gordon Axelson. Gordon's not with us anymore, but Gordon and a few other guys would go out with us when we were tracing this thing. And we stopped at Porter's several times. And Porter was an old farmer. He'd run a store. And Porter would put us on his John Deere Gator, and he'd ride us all over the place and show us where the railroad went. Well, one day we're out there, and Kenny and Desmond Kendrick and Gordon and me, and we're all on this John Deere Gator, and Porter pulls up to his watermelon patch and says, "Get off, boys, and get you one." Well, I jumped off that thing just as hard as I could go. And the other guys, who were all kind of city fellas, "Oh no, Mr. Bondurant, oh no, no." Well, you never tell a farmer that you don't want his watermelon. That's insulting to him. So Porter revs up the John Deere and takes off, and there I am. I'm holding the biggest watermelon I've ever seen in my life. And I had to walk all the way back up to the house because no one realized I wasn't on the John Deere anymore. Next one, Cole. How many of you remember Petticoat Junction, the TV show? Yeah. Cole's over here going, "What in the heck is he talking about now?" There were about a dozen water tanks along this railroad. And Porter told this story about how when they were younger, he and his siblings and the neighbor kids, they'd all go skinny dipping in the water tower for the railroad. They were still there. And Porter said he never saw anything that looked like those three there on the bottom left. But this was a TV show for you too young to understand what I'm talking about. That was on, I said, CBS, I believe. And it was about this Shady Rest Hotel and this woman who had the three good-looking daughters, and the train came through, and yada, yada, yada. But Kenny and I, you'll see the dog there, we never ran into one landowner who didn't let us cross his property. We never ran into one dog who growled at us. Everybody was just tickled to death about the Dinky, and they still are. This still, I did a program in Ararat at the Ruritan Club last year before last, and I think we had like 60 people show up, and they all had a Dinky story. We were there for a long time. Nicole, when you go home tonight, I want you to watch an episode of Petticoat Junction. Next slide, please. So you remember the map? We get up to what they call Pettigo. Well, Porter's family were the Pettigos. And so they had a store, a post office, all this sort of thing right there along the railroad. And one thing they did, and I still marvel at this, if you look at the bottom map, you can see this is all very good bottomland along Clark's Creek. They dammed up Clark's Creek a little bit, and in the winter it would freeze up, and people, believe it or not, would come and ice skate on the little pond it made there because it wasn't very deep. But they would bring people up on the railroad, and they would get off and ice skate. That was one of the excursions they did. And just to show you, the top left there is the old farm road on the Jessup place, and we think that's the railroad bed. There are places where Kenny and I would be walking, and we would say, "Well, that's it right there," and we would follow it, and then it would disappear. Modern roads and all sorts of things there. So the red line on all these maps is where we think the railroad went. And now we've turned away from what we call the Ararat River, and we're going up Clark's Creek. And we're going to go up Clark's Creek for a good bit of this railroad. They built the first 16 miles of it and then added another 4 or 5 later. They didn't build it all at once, but about the first 16 miles they built at once. Next one, please, Cole. And it goes up to what we call the Home Place Road. And about where it says Home Place Road on the middle of this slide is the house that I grew up in. So I literally grew up just right up the hill from where this railroad came. So, you know, boys being boys, we go walking through the woods and stuff, and we would find things about this railroad, spikes and stuff. We never found any rails at this part of it, but we did find spikes and things like that. And again, a couple more pictures relating to this railroad. It amazed me how many pictures I was able to find about this railroad. The thing you, next slide if you will, Cole. You'll notice the pond there in the bottom right. When this railroad was running, there was no flood control. The Dan River has got 2 dams on it now. The Ararat River This is one of the flood control dams that feed the feeder streams on the area. So there's no flood control. So anytime they had a massive storm, it would wash out this railroad. And I think that's what really is going to doom it eventually, is the rivers and creeks that run by it, because it's going right through, and there's no way to protect it. Kenny's standing there in the top again at a big trestle we found out in the woods near this area. And we found these all along the path of this. And like I said, we walked the whole 20 miles of it over the course of 3 or 4 winters. And Wanda Isaac's dogs followed us, I think, half the trip there. So they got a slide of their own. Next one, Cole. Ladies and gentlemen, the man, the myth, the legend, Anthony Terry. Anthony, he's one of those fellows, he has a bulldozer and a dump truck, and he moves earth and does stuff. In about 2009, Anthony calls me and says, Tom, you might want to come up here tomorrow. I found something. He found something all right. He found the Mount Airy Eastern Railroad for about a quarter mile still there. He was uncovering the property line between his neighbor, James Clement, and his cousin. And the whole property line for about a quarter mile was the railroad, still where it had been all that time. Next one, Cole. Here's Kenny supervising. Kenny has a great future in DOT, supervising men who work. You'll notice over here in the bottom left, there's this tree. Well, the railroad went right through this tree. So Anthony's out there pushing this thing over, going to expose the rails. Well, he did something, and about 3 feet of this railroad flies up in the air and lands right in front of me and Kenny. Kenny and I go over and try to pick it up, and it took both of us to pick up a 3-foot piece of this railroad. It was that heavy. And so Anthony, over the course of a few days, he cleared the whole thing to see how much he had. Next one, Cole. And you can see part of it there. Some of it, the rails got disengaged, but in some places it's exactly as it was. What we think happened was there were 2 Clement brothers who, this was the property line to their property, and the railroad was right in the middle. So rather than dig it up and move it, they got into an argument over who actually owned the railroad. So they just covered it up and buried it and left it because they couldn't decide who actually owned the railroad. Porter, who you met earlier in this thing, Porter's comment about all of this was, well, Tom, most of this railroad got tore up for scrap and we sold it to the Japanese and they shot it back at us. So that was Porter's comment.
How deep under the
Not very, not very. I mean, you can see the excess dirt here. He found it pretty easy. And once he figured out what he does, he just put the blade of his bulldozer on the rails and just went down through there, and there it was. I mean,
the previous slide, it looked like it was a lot deeper.
in places it was, like right here on the right and right here, it's pretty close to the ground. There are other places where it seemed to sink down a little bit, but it's still there. And if you fellows ever come, I'll show you exactly where this is. But next one, please, Cole. So up on the top left there, we think there was a siding along the main road, and this is very close to where Anthony lives. What happened a lot of times with this is that the main road destroyed the railroad. It's in the same place. So there was a siding here, and one of the stories about these same, I think, Clement brothers, was that they discovered that there were a couple of cars loaded with timber on the siding. And being boys, they discovered that train cars have brakes. And then if you release the brake, the car will start to move. And so there's 3 or 4 of these cars loaded with lumber on the siding, and they get on that thing and unleash it, and they start down to back towards Mount Airy. And they get going along, they're having a great time, and then they realize that they're on the railroad going down, getting faster and faster and faster, and they do the prudent thing and they jump off and let the train keep going with no engine, and it goes down about where Anthony's house was, and it derailed and lumber went everywhere, all over the bottom there. And in the vernacular, that's my story and I'm sticking to it. I can never get the Clement family to admit which one of them really did this, but they all claim to know about it. So there you go. Now, what this railroad is doing is it's followed Clark's Creek up to here, and this is what we call the crossroads. The crossroad is where the Squirrel Spur Road will go up the Blue Ridge Mountains, and Unity Church Road will go right over towards Highway 103. And right here is what they call Carter's Mill. Next slide, Cole. And this is Bobby Clement and her husband, Romy. And Bobby's the one who gave me most of these pictures. Bobby's still alive. She's about 90 years old. And she shared all of these pictures you see with me. The bottom left is, I had to take my time and do this right, the Clark's Creek Progressive Primitive Baptist Church School. This was the school for African Americans in Patrick County before 1967, because you know they were separate, not very equal in Patrick County, and there was a church right beside this, and that's where all the black kids went to school until 1967. The fella, my dad was a principal in Patrick County for 30 years, and when he retired, the fellow that took his job as principal was a fellow named Fred Brim, and Fred went to this school. He couldn't go to Blue Ridge where my father taught, but he ended up being the principal. So quite a story. One of those fellows I wish he'd let me write a book about him. Next slide, please. So how many of you heard of Bob Childress, the man who moved a mountain? Some of you I'm sure have. Cole raises his hand. Yeah, I'll bet you have. I'll bet you have. Bob Childress is the Presbyterian preacher who did all the rock churches that are along the Blue Ridge Parkway. What you may not know about him, though, is for the first 40 years of his life, he was a blacksmith. And he had a blacksmith shop along the Dinky Railroad. And there's a famous story in this book. This book's one of the most sold books along the Blue Ridge Parkway. And those churches are very, very popular. But when Bob was a blacksmith, he lived there with almost in sight of this church. And in the Man Who Moved a Mountain, one of the things he did was he invited the choir from this church to come to his rock churches and sing. Now, this is in the 1940s and 50s. That's a little brave to do because, you know, we're very much segregated then. But I think he had heard them singing when he was blacksmithing. And so he invited all the choirs from that church, the Progressive Primitive Baptist Church, to come and sing in his churches. Bob has a grandson who's named Stuart Childress, and Stuart and I worked together at Insteel. He was a truck dispatcher. When he got about 40, he got the calling to do what? To be a Presbyterian preacher. And he's just retired recently, and he preached at a lot of his grandfather's churches. But anyway, Bob Childress, the man who moved a mountain, lived along the Dinky. Next one, Cole. Here's Bateman Strait. We were talking about doing 140 in the Bateman Strait was a spur off of the Dinky Railroad. It's still the road today. We call it Bateman Strait. This is the Bateman House here on the bottom left. And it's one of those places, I think they were trying to figure out a way to connect it up to the Danville and Western over in Stuart. And one of the things they did was they built this long straightaway, which you can see on the map. The railroad that went into Kibler followed the river, and you see it meandering, curving, and that sort of thing. This is the bridge over the Dan River at what we call Metafield, and we'll talk a lot about Metafield here in a minute. But when I was growing up, I lived next to retired Army Sergeant Zeb Scales. He was Zeb Stewart Scales. He claimed they messed up his birth certificate. He should have been Jeb Stewart Scales, but we won't go there. But Zeb was in Korea and in Vietnam. He's probably the most decorated non-commissioned soldier ever come out of our county. I know this because after he died, it was over at the house, and they had a little shadow box on the end table, and there was a silver star, 2 bronze stars, a purple heart, just all kinds of stuff. And I got looking at this thing, and I thought, dang, Zeb, why didn't you ever tell me about this? You know, he wouldn't talk about it. Like most men who have seen the real thing don't want to talk about it. But we got the bridge named after him because, like I said, he's probably the most decorated soldier from our county. And the reason I know this is when I was in high school, I rode the bus with his kids, and we'd get on the bus together. And on mornings where it was just ice cold, as it gets sometime in Patrick County, Zeb was a deputy sheriff, and he come riding out of the driveway in this big green Chrysler, and I'm not kidding you, the windows in the houses would shake. This thing had such a racket to it. And he would take us to school in this big Chrysler, warm. Oh, it was nice. And every time we got to this bridge, he would tell us about how he helped build it in 1947. Uh, most of his children's eyes were rolling up in their heads because Cole, you can relate to this. They'd heard this story so many times they were sick of it, but I wasn't. I was like fascinated. You built this bridge, really? You know. So after he passed away, we got him to name it after him. Uh, he pulled a Forrest Gump. He pulled a real Forrest Gump. You know the scene in Forrest Gump where Forrest is telling Lyndon Johnson that he got shot in the buttocks. Zeb really did get shot in the buttocks, saving a general's life from being assassinated. And for some reason, he thought that was funny, but he wouldn't tell us about anything else that he did. Next one, Cole. So we're to Meadowfield. And Meadowfield is where Geneva Nunn's family, shown here in the middle with her son and her husband, Carl Griffith. Like I told somebody earlier, Geneva's family are all musicians. They play bluegrass, and I think that's where Andy Griffith got it, with the music side, was from her family. And this is Carl Griffith, Andy's father. Carl, it was supposedly in Mount Airy, has a reputation of being just a tremendous storyteller. He was really good at spinning a weave, you know. And Andy's first wife said that Carl Griffith was the best storyteller she ever heard. And she was married to Andy Griffith. Anyway, next one there, Cole. So this is Meadowfield. And this is where Geneva's family lived nearby. And this was a little area there where the railroad came to the Dan River, and they would have sidings and they'd supplies and all sorts of things. There was a little store there. This map was drawn by a fellow named Jim Love. Jim had been a colonel in Vietnam in the U.S. Air Force. When I was in high school, he was the head of the ROTC, and we were scared to death of him. He was one tough dude, let me just tell you. He wasn't very big, but he put the fear into you. Later in life, I came to realize that he was all talk, that he actually was as eat up with this stuff as I was. So Jim would go out with us and walk us and tell us, and he drew this map of Meadowfield for me because he had actually seen it. And he said this is about 1915 that he estimates it. So you can see things there about it. One of the stories, yeah.
Is this in relation to the end of the line up by?
This is right where the bridge I showed you is. This is right where the bridge I showed in the slide previously, where the bridge crosses the Dan River. That's where Meadowfield is. It's right there. And this is one of the places where you can walk the railroad, almost a pristine roadbed, back toward the Sawmill Road, we call it, along the Dan River. And the railroad bed is just about perfect. You could go in there right now, take a weed eater, and you'd have a walking trail for about a mile right there. And that's right here along this. But again, I go back to this thing, find an old person and ask them. And that's what I did. And Jim walked us all through this thing and drew us maps and showed us and told stories about when he was young that the Kibler Valley boys would block the road to keep the boys from Stuart from coming over to steal the girls. I mean, he was something else, let me tell you, was. And we were terrified of him in high school. I kid you not. He also is the guy I was telling somebody earlier. He's also the one that took Andy Griffith around when they were both alive and showed Andy where his family lived, where they were buried, and just all kinds of things. So Jim would take Andy Griffith around and actually showed him some of this. So this is right where the bridge is that crosses the Dan River. And today it's just bottomland, really good bottomland, and the Bateman House is still there, but that's about it. There's nothing else there. But like I said, I got Jim to draw me this map, and he rode around with us and showed us all kinds of things relating to Kibler Valley and this part of the railroad. Next one, Cole. These are some things I found in newspapers and stuff about the railroad, little advertisements and things like that. You'll see leaves Mount Airy, arrives at Danube. Now what happens is about 1916, we had two, I don't know if they were tropical storms or hurricanes or what, but they hit within a week of each other. About 1916. This is a very famous flood in western North Carolina too. And I think it pretty much wipes out a good portion of this railroad. They're going to try to rebuild it and do some things, but in 1916, it really took a hit. And that's because, again, there's no flood control on any of these streams I'm telling you about. And the railroad is always going to be very close to the water. And I think it really, really does a number on it. Next one, Cole. This is one of the only pictures I have of the railroad once it's in Kibler Valley. And that's why this railroad was built. Kibler Valley, where the Dan River comes out of the mountains, was virgin forest. It had never been cut. And we're talking about trees as big around as this room. I've seen pictures where men look like little ants next to the trees in Kibler Valley. So imagine the circumference of a tree that big. This is, of course, before the chestnut blight takes out the chestnut trees. So they're here. And the reason this railroad was built was to cut down the trees and take them to Mount Airy and take them to the furniture factories and other things. But this is Kibler Valley, and you can kind of see the incline on the right here of where it went up. This is a very, very rugged place. I'll tell you a story. I grew up with 3 or 4 of the Willis boys, and the Willis boys' father, he ran the powerhouse that Danville built at the top of Kibler Valley. And we would go up there. They had a full court basketball up at the top of Kibler Valley, and we'd go up there and play because it was so cool compared to what it would be. But the problem with Kibler Valley is after about noon, it got dark because the mountains were so high, it got dark. I'm not making that up. So we would go and play basketball in the mornings when it was cool until it got dark. Next one, please, Cole. So this is Danube Presbyterian Church. Mr. Kibler was a man from West Virginia. He came in and logged the valley, and so it became Kibler Valley. This church had been there. We think the railroad helped build this church, and Mr. Kibler helped. And here's some pictures of it at different stages. It's still there, and it is a beautiful place. We think the railroad ended right to the left of the church, another Y. And they would back it up, load the logs, and then take it back to Mount Airy going straight. But this is the Danube Presbyterian Church that you can still go visit. Kibler is a great place to fish if you're interested. I know at least one person in here who's interested in that, but it's a great place to go and fish. A lot of people have retirement and weekend cabins in Kibler Valley. It's beautiful, a beautiful place. Next one, please, Cole. So during the time this railroad ran, they did excursions. They would take people up to Kibler Valley. They would take the local militia. Kenny's great uncle, for instance, was one of the people who would go with the local militia, and they would do target shooting and things up in Kibler Valley. But the one that just blows my mind to this day, and this is the Mount Airy Museum's model railroad. And of course, the White Sulphur Springs and Kibler Valley are not close to each other. They're 20 miles apart. But because of the, you got to shrink everything down. Believe it or not, they took a circus to Kibler Valley on this train and had a circus there beside the church. And I know this is true because I've had so many people tell me about it, and Jim Love and others who saw it. So there are elephants and all sorts of animals, and be a good place for Allison Snyder, not Allison Elizabeth, be a good place for Allie. But they actually took a circus one time to Kibler Valley on this train. People would ride up for all sorts of things. They would put flat cars, and people would sit on chairs and things and go up to Kibler. This is a very bad map about Patrick County, but it's got some interesting things. But you see the proximity to Surrey County and to Stokes County on this thing. Carroll County, you were talking about there on the left, where one of you got the books you were telling. And so that's a very bad map of Patrick County, but it gives you an idea geographically where this is. Next one, Cole. This is the Collins house. People would come up on the train and they would spend the night in the Collins house. It was like a bed and breakfast. And it was right there beside the Danube Presbyterian Church. So you could go up and stay with the Collins family. Mr. Collins, who passed away not that long ago, sat on the front porch and just regaled me with stories about the Dinky Railroad while he was still alive. But it's still there. They also have a river run in Kibler Valley every July where they open up the powerhouse and let the water go, and you can get on there in your canoe or whatever and ride the Dan River. Dan River is got a lot more water in it than the Ararat does, I will tell you that. Next one, Cole. So about 20 years ago, we had found so many of these rails and stuff that we went to our buddy Raleigh Puckett. Raleigh Puckett has this thing up near the Doe Run Church in Ararat called the Hollow History Center. They used to call Ararat the Hollow, singular, not plural, but singular, the Hollow. So Raleigh, over the years, has, oh gosh, he's probably bought 10 cabins and has rebuilt them on his little place there and turned it into a little history center. Well, Raleigh decided he wanted to build a little piece of the Dinky. So Kenny, we got some rails from Anthony Terry. Kenny got some ties. We found some spikes, and 4 or 5 of us went to building a railroad. We of course had a tractor and a chainsaw and all kinds of things that they didn't have when they really built this thing. Next one, please, Cole. And here we are, just different things doing it, measured it off. And what happened was Kenny and Ron Hall, who were standing together there in the top, they got into an argument about how you build a railroad, and they just wouldn't stop arguing about how to do it and this kind of thing. And Raleigh got so sick of them arguing, he just started to build it himself and started swinging the sledgehammer. Next one, please, Cole. And there he is swinging the sledgehammer. He had had enough of Ron and Kenny, and he went to work on it by himself. And one more, Cole. And there they are. Notice how the chests are all puffed out like they've done something. But Ron on the right here is an expert on the Hillsville Shootout from 1912. He's written books about the Hillsville Shootout. Raleigh there used to run the store in Ararat when I was growing up, so I've known him my whole life. Kenny, and then Nash Lawson there on the left. And I think all these fellows are still alive. And we built a little piece of the Dinky Railroad together there at Raleigh's place. Next one. And there it is, the finished product. And another one of the maps that Chip found while we were doing all this. Next one, please. So folks, let me tell you, it's hard to find a narrow gauge reference in the Bible. But this is as close as I got, Matthew 7:13-14, and it's really about the narrow gate. Kenny and I were invited to Danube Presbyterian Church on their Heritage Day to talk about the railroad. So it's the only time in my life I got to be a Presbyterian minister. So there I was. And this again is at the birthplace where you fellows were up looking for it. And the railroad is now, part of it at least, is still there. And next one, please, Cole. So we have a Facebook page about this if you're interested. Chip is building a web page about the Mount Airy Eastern, which hopefully will be done soon. You can go up and to the Jeb Stewart Birthplaces page, and we have interviews from Chip's grandfather and his sister talking about riding the railroad, and you can go up and watch them. It's always kind of funny to see a 90-year-old man get corrected by his older sister. That's always kind of a fun thing to witness. Porter was a fellow who liked to spin a yarn, and maybe sometimes Cole would, well, he would too, but Porter would exaggerate a little bit about all this stuff. So his sister would pop him in the shoulder and say, now, Porter, you know that's not true. You know that's not true. One more, Cole. And that's the video of Porter talking. And he's about an hour or so, and he's just having a big time. And hit it one more time. And it might pop up, but hit it again, Cole, just to see. And my claim to fame with this is I got to be on Roy's, folks, because of the Dinky Railroad. If any of you watch WGHP, remember when they did Roy's folks? Chad Tucker and came when doing it. And I got to be on Roy's folks, which got me to go to that wonderful Arts and Crafts Festival they used to do in High Point, which was a lot of fun. But I got to be on TV with Cindy Farmer for a few minutes. Cindy and I both went to Virginia Tech at the same time. We kind of knew each other at Tech, but not real well. And so I go into the studio, and from across the building, I hear "Hookie Man," and it's Cindy Farmer yelling at me. So anyway, thank y'all very much. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to try to answer. If you want me to let Cole tell stories about what it's like to have me as a grandfather, we can do that too. And I have books up here.